Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Architect of His Own Ruin. James Reed had always been a builder, not of houses or monuments, but of quieter things, trust, stability, a life measured in mortgage payments and anniversary dinners at the same Italian restaurant where he'd proposed. For 17 years, he'd built a marriage with Christine Palmer, believing that his steady hands and reliable heart were enough foundation for forever. He should have noticed the cracks sooner. The advertising firm he'd poured his soul into for 2 decades downsized 6 months ago, and James's position as senior creative director became a line item on his severance package. Christine had smiled when he told her, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said all the right words about fresh starts and new opportunities. Within a week, she'd filed for divorce. The proceedings were surgical. Christine's attorney, a shark named Morris McElroy with teeth capped too white and a reputation for destroying men, tore through James's finances like cancer. The house, bought with James's inheritance from his grandmother, went to Christine. The savings account drained for her emotional suffering. The car, the furniture, even the goddamn espresso machine James had saved for months to buy. Your Honor, McElroy had said, adjusting his Rolex with theatrical precision, my client sacrificed her own career aspirations to support Mr. Reed's ambitions. She deserves compensation for those lost years. The lie was so brazen James almost laughed in court. Christine had quit her receptionist job after 3 months of marriage, claiming migraines. She'd spent the next 17 years perfecting her tennis serve at the country club James couldn't afford to join. The judge, a gray-haired woman who looked like she'd heard every story twice, awarded Christine 70% of everything. James walked out of the courthouse with his clothes, his grandfather's watch, and a checking account showing $247. That night, Christine had called him, not to apologize, not to express even a shred of remorse, to gloat. You'll die alone and broke, she'd said, her laughter sharp as breaking glass. That's what happens to men who bore me, James. You were always so adequate. Roger says I should have left you years ago. Roger. The name hit him like a fist to the stomach. Roger Clements, his former business partner, the man who'd stood as best man at their wedding, who'd eaten at their table every Sunday for 5 years. The man who'd voted to eliminate James's position when the firm downsized. James had hung up without responding. What was there to say? She'd already taken everything that mattered. Almost everything. He still had his plasma. Chapter 2. The Transaction. The donation center squatted between a pawn shop and a check-cashing place on the east side, the kind of neighborhood where desperation wore a familiar face. James had driven past it 100 times, never imagining he'd be the one walking through those doors. The waiting room smelled of industrial cleaner and defeat. A teenage mother bounced a crying baby on her knee. An old man with shaking hands filled out paperwork with painful slowness. A woman James's age stared at nothing, her eyes hollow. First time, the receptionist asked. Her name tag read Kara. She had kind eyes that had seen too much. That obvious? You're wearing a tie. She pushed a clipboard across the desk. Fill this out. We pay $40 for your first donation. $40. James had spent more than that on wine he couldn't taste the difference in. Now, it was 2 weeks of groceries if he shopped carefully. He took the clipboard to a plastic chair that wobbled on uneven legs and began filling in the blanks of his diminished life. The nurse who called him back was young, professionally cheerful in a way that felt rehearsed. I'm Emily, she said, leading him to a chair that looked like it belonged in a dentist's nightmare. Ever donated before? Never. No problem. I'll need to do a quick health screening, take some vitals, test your blood. The whole process takes about 90 minutes. She wrapped a blood pressure cuff around his arm. So what brings you in today? Rent, James said simply. Emily's professional smile softened into something genuine. I hear that. She drew 3 vials of blood with practiced efficiency. Okay, I'm going to run these to the lab. Back in 5. She wasn't. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. James watched the clock, watched the other donors cycle through their chairs, tubes connected like some dystopian assembly line harvesting human fluid for profit. When Emily returned, her face had changed. The color had drained from her cheeks, and her hands trembled slightly as she gripped his file. "Sir," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I need you to stay right here. Don't move. I need to call someone." "What's wrong?" Ice flooded James's veins. "Cancer. HIV. Something terminal they'd found swimming in his blood." "Nothing's wrong. Just please wait." She disappeared into the back office. Through the window, James saw her on the phone, gesturing urgently. Two other staff members crowded around her, looking at something on her computer screen, then at James, then back at the screen. 20 minutes later, 3 men in suits rushed through the donation center doors like they owned the place. They moved with purpose, parting the crowd of donors without touching them, radiating authority and expensive cologne. The lead one was in his 60s, silver-haired, and imposing in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than James's last paycheck. His eyes found James and locked on with laser focus. He walked straight to James's chair, stopped, and stared. His face cycled through emotions, shock, disbelief, something that looked almost like relief. "After 32 years, he whispered, loud enough for James to hear, "we finally found you." Chapter 3. The Inheritance in His Veins. The man's name was Albert Riddle, CEO of Riddle Pharmaceuticals. The other two were lawyers, introduced quickly and forgotten immediately. They ushered James into a back office that the donation center clearly didn't know existed, all dark wood and leather that didn't match the fluorescent despair of the waiting room. "Mr. Reed," Albert said, settling into a chair across from James with the gravity of a man about to change someone's life, "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. But what we've discovered in your blood," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "it's nothing short of miraculous." "I have cancer," James said flatly. "What?" "No." Albert actually laughed. "Mr. Reed, you're possibly the healthiest person in this city. What you have is something we've been searching for since 1993. A genetic mutation so rare that our models suggested only 3 to 5 people on Earth possess it." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were charts, graphs, genetic sequences that looked like abstract art. 32 years ago, my daughter was diagnosed with Herman syndrome. Do you know what that is?" James shook his head. "Didn't think so. It's so rare, most doctors never see a case. It's a degenerative neurological disorder that destroyed her nervous system cell by cell. She was 8 years old." Albert's voice cracked slightly. "We tried everything. Every treatment, every experimental therapy. She died in 1995, 2 months before her 11th birthday." "I'm sorry," James said, meaning it. "After her death, I dedicated my company to finding a cure. We discovered that the disease is caused by a specific protein deficiency. The human body can't produce the protein naturally, except in the rarest cases. People with a mutation on the HRNX4 gene." Albert tapped the folder. "People like you. I don't understand. Your plasma, Mr. Reed, contains antibodies that can not only treat Herman syndrome, but potentially cure it. There are currently 847 diagnosed cases in the United States alone. Worldwide, thousands. Children dying because their bodies can't produce what yours makes naturally." One of the lawyers leaned forward. "Mr. Reed, Riddle Pharmaceuticals is prepared to offer you a contract for exclusive plasma donation rights. We're talking twice-weekly donations, full medical care, and compensation of $15 million, Albert interrupted. $5 million signing bonus, $10 million paid out over 5 years. Plus royalties on any treatment developed using your plasma." The number didn't compute. James had been counting pennies that morning, calculating whether he could afford both electricity and food. "Why?" he managed. "Because you have something money can't buy. Because 847 families are praying for what's in your veins. And because," Albert's expression hardened, "because I won't let what happened to my daughter happen to anyone else if I can prevent it." James looked at the contract the lawyer slid in front of him. The numbers were real. The signatures were real. This was actually happening. "I need to think about it," he said. Albert nodded slowly. "I understand. Take 24 hours. But Mr. Reed, please understand. Every day we delay, children are dying. They gave him a card, a phone number, and a check for $40 for his plasma donation. James walked out of the center in a daze. The contrast so surreal, he wondered if he'd imagined the entire conversation. His phone rang as he reached his car. A 15-year-old Honda that Christine's lawyer had deemed not worth fighting for. Frank Norton, his only real friend who'd survived the divorce. "James, where are you?" "I've been calling all morning." "Donating plasma," James said, the absurdity of everything hitting him at once. "Jesus. Listen, I heard something you need to know. I ran into Bridget Palmer at the grocery store. Christine's sister. The one who'd seemed sympathetic during the divorce. Who'd told James she thought Christine was being unreasonable. And she got drunk, started bragging. James, Christine, and Roger have been planning this for over a year. They wanted you out of the firm specifically so they could take your position and your shares. Roger's been promoted to CEO. They're selling the company to Whitmore Media next month for $16 million. Christine gets half because they've been partners the whole time." James's hand tightened on the phone. "She destroyed me for $8 million. There's more." Bridget said Christine specifically dragged out the divorce proceedings to drain your legal fund, make you desperate enough to accept her terms. She called it breaking you. Her words. The sun was setting, painting the parking lot in shades of red. James looked at the donation center, then at Albert Riddle's business card in his hand. $15 million. 847 dying children. And a woman who'd laughed while she destroyed him. "Frank," James said quietly, "I need you to do something for me. I need you to not tell anyone what I'm about to tell you. Can you do that?" "Of course." "Good. Because I'm about to become very wealthy. And Christine is about to learn what it costs to underestimate adequate men." Chapter 4. The Devil in the Details. James signed a contract at 9 a.m. the next morning in Albert Riddle's downtown office, a glass tower that looked down on the city like a benevolent god. The lawyers witnessed. The check cleared into his account with a digital efficiency that felt unreal. And just like that, James Reed was worth $5 million with 10 more on the way. "Welcome to Riddle Pharmaceuticals," Albert said, shaking his hand. "We'll start with comprehensive medical testing tomorrow. I want you under the care of our best people." "I appreciate that, but I have a request." Albert's eyebrows rose. "Go on." "I want my participation kept completely confidential. No press releases, no announcements. As far as the world knows, James Reed is still broke." "May I ask why?" James smiled for the first time in months. "Let's call it a social experiment." He left the building and drove straight to Frank's apartment, a modest two-bedroom where his friend had lived since his own divorce 3 years prior. Frank was waiting with coffee and the tactical mind that had made him invaluable in the Army before he'd become an accountant. "Okay," Frank said, spreading papers across his dining table. "I did some digging. Roger Clements doesn't just want your job. He wants to erase you. He's been telling everyone at the firm that you were dead weight, that you hadn't had a good idea in years. Creative revisionism. It gets better. I pulled the company's financial records. Don't ask how. The Whitmore Media deal? It's contingent on the firm showing growth. Roger's been cooking the books, attributing your projects to himself. The Kaufman campaign that won 3 awards is in the records. The Riverside rebranding that brought in $2 million, also his. James studied the documents. Months of his work, his late nights, his creative bleeding, all credited to Roger Clements. He's also been feeding information to McElroy, Christine's lawyer. Every asset you try to hide, every financial move you made, Roger told them. They've been partners since the beginning. How long have they been sleeping together? Best guess, 2 years, maybe longer. Frank poured more coffee. Here's what I don't understand. Why go through all this? Roger's got money. Christine got most of yours. Why salt the earth? Because Christine doesn't just want things. She wants to win. James remembered their early years, the way she played tennis. Not for exercise, but to dominate. How she'd ended friendships over perceived slights. How she kept score in everything. Leaving me with nothing is the ultimate victory. So what's the play? James pulled out his phone, opened his banking app, and showed Frank the balance. $5,247. Frank's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. What the hell? My blood is worth $15 million to a pharmaceutical company. They found a genetic mutation that can cure a rare disease. James smiled. Christine tried to leave me with nothing. She left me with everything. Okay, but what are you going to? I'm going to destroy them. Not with lawyers or court battles. I'm going to dismantle everything they've built, piece by piece, and I'm going to make them watch. Frank leaned back, a slow grin spreading across his face. I'm listening. Over the next 3 hours, they sketched out the framework. James would remain publicly broke, living in the cheap studio apartment he'd rented in a building that smelled of mildew and broken dreams. He continued to appear desperate, defeated. Meanwhile, he'd use his money to carefully, methodically destroy the foundations of Christine and Roger's empire. First, James said, I need information. Everything about their lives. Where's Roger vulnerable? Frank consulted his notes. He's got a gambling problem he thinks he's hiding. Poker games every Thursday at the Riverside Casino, consistently losing. He's into the house for about 60 grand. Good. What about Christine? She's expensive. Country club fees, spa memberships, that new Lexus. She's burning through the divorce settlement faster than anticipated. So they need the Whitmore media sale to go through. Desperately, James stood, walked to Frank's window. The city sprawled below, millions of people chasing their own small victories and defeats. Then we make sure it doesn't, James said, and we make sure they destroy themselves in the process. Chapter 5. Pawns and Players. The key to revenge, James learned, wasn't rage, it was patience. And capital. He started small. A shell corporation registered in Delaware under the name Norwood Ventures, managed by a corporate attorney who asked no questions as long as the retainer cleared. Through Norwood, James began acquiring debts. Roger's gambling markers were the first. $63,000 worth of bad bets, purchased from a casino for 70 cents on the dollar. Legal, clean, and suddenly James owned Roger's desperation. Don't call him, Frank warned when James suggested making contact. Not yet. Let him sweat. The casino's been patient, but Norwood Ventures doesn't have to be. Instead, James had the attorney send a polite letter demanding immediate payment. 45 days to settle the full amount, or legal action would commence. The second move was more elegant. James hired a private investigator named Marty Bishop, a former cop with a whiskey voice and a talent for finding what people wanted hidden. Marty's first assignment was simple. Document everything Roger and Christine did. Every lunch, every meeting, every indiscretion. They're not subtle. Marty reported 2 weeks later, sliding a folder of photographs across the table at the diner where they met. Country club lunches 3 times a week. She's wearing jewelry that costs more than my car. They're celebrating like they've already won. The photos showed Christine and Roger at the Riverside Country Club, champagne and oysters, laughing like teenagers. In one image, Christine wore a diamond bracelet that caught the afternoon light. James recognized it. She told him years ago it was her dream piece. $30,000 at Cartier. They're spending money they don't have yet, James observed. Counting chickens, Marty agreed. I also found something interesting. Christine's sister, Bridget Palmer? She's not as loyal as Christine thinks. Explain. She's got her own money problems. 3 credit cards maxed out, behind on her mortgage. And she's bitter. Feels like Christine got everything while she got nothing. The divorce settlement, the house, the car. Bridget's one conversation away from spilling every secret she knows. James smiled. Then let's have that conversation. Bridget Palmer lived in a townhouse in the suburbs, the kind of place that looked nice from the street, but had an air of quiet desperation in the details. The overgrown lawn, the faded paint, the decade-old minivan with a cracked windshield. James knocked on her door on a Tuesday morning, armed with coffee and an offer. She answered in yoga pants and a stained sweatshirt, her hair pulled back. James, what are you doing here? I wanted to thank you for what you told Frank. About Christine and Roger's plan. Bridget's face went pale. I was drunk. I shouldn't have said anything. I'm glad you did. Can I come in? She hesitated, then stepped aside. The townhouse interior confirmed his suspicions. Furniture from better times, photographs of children who'd grown up and moved away, the worn carpet of someone who couldn't afford to replace it. "I'm not here to cause trouble," James said, settling onto her couch. "I'm here to offer you a job." "A job?" "Christine trusts you. Tells you things. I need to know what she's planning, what she's worried about, what keeps her up at night." He pulled an envelope from his jacket. $10,000 now. $5,000 a month for 6 months. All you have to do is be your sister. Listen, remember, tell me. Bridget stared at the envelope like it might bite her. That's a lot of money. Consider it payment for years of being undervalued. Christine got millions in the divorce. What did you get? Debt and a sister who only calls when she needs someone to brag to. Her hand reached for the envelope, stopped. "Why are you doing this?" "Because she laughed when she took everything from me. Because Roger destroyed my career and called it business. Because I've learned that adequate men, when pushed far enough, become dangerous." James stood. "You don't have to decide now. But Bridget, your mortgage is 3 months behind. Your credit cards are maxed. How long before you lose this place?" He left the envelope on her coffee table and walked to the door. "James," she called as he reached for the handle. "What are you going to do to her?" "I'm going to give her exactly what she deserves," he said. "The question is, do you want to be collateral damage, or do you want to survive?" She called him that night and agreed. Chapter 6. The board is set. The medical testing at Riddle Pharmaceuticals took 3 weeks. Dr. Virginia Murphy, head of research, ran every scan, every analysis, mapping James's genetic code with the precision of a cartographer charting new worlds. "Remarkable," she said during one session, staring at screens of data. "Your body produces the protein naturally at rates we've never seen. We can synthesize a treatment from your plasma that could help all 847 current patients. Maybe more." "How many children?" James asked. "About 60% are under 18. The youngest is 6 months old." 6 months. James thought of Albert Riddle's daughter, dead at 10, and felt something shift in his chest. The money was life-changing, but this mattered. "When can you start treating them?" "We're in FDA approval now. 6 months, maybe 8. Your plasma is already saving lives, James. You should know that." Meanwhile, the trap was closing on Roger and Christine. Bridget proved invaluable. Every lunch, every phone call, every pillow talk confession, she remembered all. James learned that Christine was already planning her next upgrade. A house in the hills, $500,000, purchased with money from the Whitmore media sale. "She's picking out furniture," Bridget reported during one of their weekly meetings. "Spending Roger's future like it's already in her account." Roger, meanwhile, was hemorrhaging cash. The gambling continued. Thursday nights at the Riverside, Friday nights, an underground poker club Frank's contacts had identified. Norwood Ventures collection letters had escalated. Roger's secretary had been dodging calls for weeks. James's third move was surgical. He bought Christine's dream house. Not under his name. Through another shell corporation, Redwood Holdings, he made an all-cash offer $20,000 above asking price. The sellers accepted within hours. Christine's realtor called her that same afternoon to deliver the bad news. Bridget reported the aftermath with barely contained glee. She threw her phone across the room, screamed for an hour, blamed Roger for not closing the Whitmore deal faster. "Good," James said. "Keep me updated." The Whitmore media deal was his endgame. Frank had been digging, and what he found was beautiful in its simplicity. The deal was contingent on the firm showing consistent growth and ethical business practices. If Whitmore discovered fraud, creative accounting, stolen credit for campaigns, they'd walk away. James just needed proof. He found it in the firm's server, accessed through a backdoor that a talented hacker named Dale Benson had found for the right price. Roger's entire scheme was there. Emails reassigning James's projects, altered timesheets, fabricated client testimonials. Months of fraud, documented and time-stamped. "This is gold," Frank said, reviewing the files. "But how do you get it to Whitmore without revealing your hand?" James smiled. "We don't. We get someone else to." The anonymous tip to Whitmore Media's due diligence team came from a burner phone, untraceable. The email contained detailed allegations of fraud at James's former firm, complete with instructions on where to look in the company's server. Professional, concerned, devastating. Whitmore's lawyers descended on the firm 3 days later. Roger called an emergency staff meeting. Bridget learned about it from Christine, who was panicking. "He's terrified," Bridget reported. Christine too. "Whitmore's auditors found something. They're investigating. Tell Christine you're worried about her," James instructed. "Be supportive. Let her trust you more." The next week, Norwood Ventures filed a lawsuit against Roger Clements for the $63,000 plus interest and legal fees. The summons was served at his office, in front of his staff, a public humiliation that made the local business news. Christine called Bridget that night, drunk and furious. "Everything's falling apart," she slurred. "The Whitmore deal might collapse. Roger's being sued. I spent too much on the house deposit, and now someone else bought it. What the hell is happening?" "Bad luck," Bridget suggested. "There's no such thing as luck. Someone's doing this." "Who would do this to you?" Christine's laugh was bitter. "I don't know, but when I find out, I'm going to destroy them." Bridget reported the conversation to James. "She's getting paranoid. Suspects someone's targeting them, but doesn't know who." "Perfect," James said. "Let's give her something else to worry about." He had Dale Benson create a fake social media profile. A beautiful woman named Cassandra, supposedly Roger's type. Cassandra sent Roger a friend request, started liking his posts, commenting with just enough flirtation to be noticed. Roger, predictable as sunrise, took the bait. Within a week, he was messaging Cassandra privately. Within 2, he was suggesting they meet. James forwarded the messages to Christine anonymously. The explosion was nuclear. Bridget called James that night, laughing so hard she could barely speak. Christine destroyed his car, took a golf club to his Porsche in the country club parking lot. Security had to pull her off. It's all over the club's social media. And Roger, denying everything, says it's fake. But Christine doesn't believe him. Bridget paused. "James, what's the endgame here?" "Justice," James said simply. "Keep watching." Chapter 7. The House of Cards. The Whitmore media deal collapsed on a Wednesday. Their attorneys issued a statement citing irregularities in financial reporting and questions about ethical business practices. Translation: they found Roger's fraud and wanted no part of it. The firm's value plummeted overnight. Roger's promotion, his reputation, his future, all gone in a corporate press release that was 3 paragraphs of professional destruction. Christine called Bridget hysterical. $16 million gone? How are we supposed to? She stopped, catching herself. How is Roger supposed to recover from this? What about your settlement money? Bridget asked innocently. I spent it. Most of it. The deposits, the car, the country club fees. I thought the Whitmore money was coming. Her voice cracked. What am I supposed to do now? James listened to the recording Bridget had made and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt. Just a cold certainty that this was exactly what Christine deserved. But he wasn't finished. Roger, desperate and cornered, made the mistake James had been waiting for. He tried to embezzle money from the firm to cover his gambling debts. Not much, $50,000 from the company's reserve account, covered with falsified vendor invoices. James had been monitoring the firm's finances through Dale Benson's access. The moment Roger made his move, James documented everything and sent it to the firm's board of directors. The vote to terminate Roger was unanimous. The criminal charges followed within days. Frank called James with the news. Roger's been arrested. Wire fraud, embezzlement. The DA is pushing for prison time. And Christine, she's lawyering up. Apparently, her name is on some of the bank transfers. The DA thinks she might be a co-conspirator. That wasn't part of James's plan, but he didn't try to stop it. Sometimes justice found its own way. The final piece fell into place when Bridget delivered her last report. Christine wants to see you, she said. James's hand tightened on his phone. What? She called me this morning. Said she needs to talk to you. She sounds broken. Did she say why? Something about mistakes and apologies. James, I think she's finally realized how bad things are. Tell her I'll meet her. Tomorrow. The coffee shop where we had our first date. Bridget hesitated. Are you going to hurt her? I'm going to tell her the truth, James said. That's worse. He met Christine at 2 p.m. on a Thursday, in the same corner booth where he'd nervously asked for her number 20 years ago. She looked different, smaller somehow, her expensive clothes hanging wrong, her makeup unable to hide the stress lines around her eyes. "James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for coming." He said nothing, just watched her struggle for words. "I know I don't deserve your time. I know what I did was," she stopped, swallowed. "Roger and I are in serious trouble. The charges, the lawyers, it's all falling apart. I need help." "You need money," James corrected. "Yes." She couldn't meet his eyes. "I know I have no right to ask, but you were always generous, always kind. Maybe we could work something out. Alone. I could pay you back when." "When what, Christine?" "When Roger gets out of prison. When you're acquitted of fraud. When the money fairy drops 16 million in your lap." She flinched. "You're right. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." "You laughed," James said quietly. "When you called me that night. You told me I'd die alone and broke, and you laughed. Do you remember that?" "I was angry. I didn't mean." "You meant every word. You spent a year planning how to destroy me. You and Roger gutted my career, took my home, drained my accounts. You called it winning." He leaned forward. "Did you win, Christine?" Tears ran down her face, ruining her mascara. "I made mistakes. I was stupid and cruel, and you were who you've always been. I just didn't want to see it." He stood to leave. "Please," she grabbed his arm. "James, I'm begging you. I'll lose everything." He looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. For 17 years, he'd loved this woman, built a life with her, and she destroyed it all for money and the pleasure of watching him suffer. "Good," he said, pulling his arm free. "Now you know what it feels like." He walked out of the coffee shop and didn't look back. Chapter 8. Resurrection. 3 months later, James stood in Dr. Virginia Murphy's lab, watching the first patient receive treatment derived from his plasma. The girl's name was Abigail, Kentucky. She was 7 years old, her body ravaged by Herman's syndrome until she could barely walk. Her parents had exhausted every option, sold everything they owned to pay for experimental treatments that didn't work. Now she sat in a hospital bed, and 4-drip feeding James's synthesized antibodies into her system, while her parents held each other and cried. "The results are remarkable," Dr. Murphy said softly. "We're seeing improvement in 73% of trial patients. Real improvement, nervous system regeneration we thought impossible. How long until full FDA approval? 3 months, maybe 4, and we could treat everyone." She looked at him. "You're going to save hundreds of lives, James. Thousands eventually." He watched Abigail's mother smooth her daughter's hair, murmuring prayers of gratitude. "What about the money?" he asked. "The royalties? Based on current projections, you're looking at another 20 million over the next 10 years. More if the treatment proves effective for related disorders. $35 million. James tried to comprehend the number and couldn't. It was abstract, impossible, more money than he'd ever imagined existing in his reality. "I want to set up a foundation," he said, "for families who can't afford treatment. Full funding, no questions asked." Dr. Murphy smiled. "Albert said you'd do something like that. He's already had the lawyers draw up the paperwork. The Riddle Reed Foundation. Has a nice ring to it." Albert appeared in the doorway, as if summoned. "Talking about me?" "Only good things," James assured him. "Liar." Albert moved to the observation window, watching Abigail. "My daughter would have been 38 this year. Married, probably. Maybe grandchildren." He was quiet for a moment. "Because of you, this girl gets to have that future. You gave her what I couldn't give my daughter. You built the company that made it possible. We make a good team." Albert extended his hand. "Welcome to the board, by the way. The directors voted this morning. You're officially part of Riddle Pharmaceuticals leadership. I don't know anything about running a pharmaceutical company. You don't need to. You know about building things, about patience and precision and seeing the long game. We need that perspective." Albert's grip was firm, paternal. "You've been given a gift, James. What you do with it defines who you are." James thought about Christine and Roger. Their trials were next month. Fraud, embezzlement, enough charges to ensure years in prison. He could have pushed harder, made things worse. But watching them destroy themselves had been more satisfying than any revenge he could have orchestrated. "I choose to build," he said. Chapter 9. Adequate no more. 6 months after the plasma donation that changed his life, James stood in his new home. Not the mansion Christine had wanted, but a comfortable house in a good neighborhood with a yard big enough for the dog he'd always wanted, but she'd refused. Frank was helping him move in, arguing about where the couch should go. "It's too far from the TV," Frank insisted. "It's perfect. You just want it closer because you're going blind." "I'm not going blind. You bought a TV that's too small. It's 70 inches. Like I said, too small." James's phone rang. "Bridget, I thought you should know," she said. The sentencing was today. Roger got 8 years. Christine got 5. "Are you okay?" James asked. "I'm better than them. Better than I've been in years, actually. The money you paid me clear my debts. I'm going back to school, business administration. Figure it's time to build something of my own instead of watching other people succeed." "Good for you, James. Thank you for giving me a choice, for not lumping me in with Christine. You chose yourself. That's all anyone can do." After he hung up, Frank looked at him expectantly. "Well, Christine got 5 years. Roger got 8. Frank nodded slowly. "How do you feel?" "I don't know. Empty, maybe? I spent months planning their downfall, and now that it's happened, it just feels finished." "That's because revenge was never the point. You wanted justice. You wanted them to face consequences for what they did. That's different, is it?" "Yeah. Revenge is about hurting people because you're hurt. Justice is about balance, making things right." Frank settled onto the couch, in the wrong spot. James noticed, but didn't comment. "So what now?" "Now I live. I build the foundation. I work with the pharmaceutical company. I figure out who James Reed is when he's not someone's husband or someone's employee or someone's mark." "Sounds adequate," Frank said with a grin. James threw a pillow at him. The doorbell rang. Albert Riddle stood on the porch, holding a bottle of wine that probably cost more than James's first car. "Housewarming gift," Albert said. "May I?" "Please." They sat in the backyard as the sun set. 3 men who'd found unexpected friendship in unusual circumstances. Albert told stories about his daughter, about the company's early days, about the dozens of children whose lives James's blood had saved. "We got the latest results today," Albert said. "Abigail Kent is walking. Not just standing, not just a few steps walking. Her parents sent me a video. She's running around her backyard, laughing." James felt something catch in his throat. There are 42 other stories just like hers. Kids getting better, families getting hope. "Because of you," Albert raised his glass. "To James Reed, who proved that adequate men, when given the chance, are capable of extraordinary things." They drank to that. Later, alone in his new bedroom, James thought about the plasma donation that had started everything, about walking into that center with $40 worth of hope and walking out with a future he never could have imagined. Christine had been wrong. He hadn't died alone and broke. He'd been reborn, surrounded by people who valued him, doing work that mattered, building a life that was truly his. And somewhere in a prison cell, Christine was learning what it meant to lose everything. The symmetry was almost poetic. James's phone buzzed, a text from Dr. Murphy. Another success story, another child responding to treatment. He read it, smiled, and set the phone aside. Tomorrow he'd go to the foundation office, review grant applications from families desperate for help. He'd meet with the Riddle Board, discuss expansion into research for related disorders. He'd live this impossible life that had been handed to him. But tonight, he'd sleep in his own home, in a bed he'd chosen, in a future he'd built from the ashes of his old life. Adequate? No, he was so much more than that. And he always had been. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Burn. The steam from the iron hissed like a serpent as Miranda Caldwell pressed the heated metal against her 23-year-old daughter's forearm. Crystal Lancaster's scream pierced through the suburban evening, a sound that would haunt the Caldwell household forever. Trash deserves to burn. Miranda laughed, her voice carrying a venom that seemed foreign coming from a woman who had once sung lullabies to the same child, now writhing in pain on the kitchen floor. Brian Raymond, Crystal's 25-year-old half-brother, watched from the doorway with cold amusement. "If I were her, I'd have burned her face too," he snorted, adjusting his designer jacket, a gift from his mother's latest shopping spree. Aaron Haley stood in the shadows of the hallway, his weathered hands clenched into fists. At 52, he had built an empire from nothing, a construction company that employed over 300 people across the state. His steel-gray eyes, which had intimidated union negotiators and corrupt politicians alike, now burned with a fury that made his professional reputation seem tame. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He simply watched as his wife of 15 years revealed her true nature, and his stepson, the boy he had raised since age 10, showed his gratitude with cruelty. Aaron had met Miranda when Crystal was 8 and Brian was 10. Their father, a deadbeat named Thomas Lancaster, had abandoned them for a cocktail waitress in Vegas. Aaron had stepped in, not just as a provider, but as a father figure who had funded Brian's college education, bought Crystal her first car, and treated them as his own blood. The burn would heal, but the betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. As Miranda tended to her manicured nails, seemingly forgetting the child writhing on the floor, Aaron made his decision. He knelt beside Crystal, his calloused hands gentle as he examined the iron-shaped wound on her forearm. "We're leaving," he told her quietly. "Aaron, don't be dramatic," Miranda called from across the kitchen, not even turning around. She had it coming. Little bitch was disrespecting me in my own house. Crystal's offense had been questioning why her mother needed another shopping trip when Aaron was working 70-hour weeks to maintain their lifestyle. The girl worked 2 jobs, waiting tables and cleaning offices, trying to save for nursing school while living at home. Aaron helped Crystal to her feet, noting how Brian smirked at his sister's pain. The boy had always been Miranda's favorite, spoiled and entitled despite Aaron's attempts to instill work ethic and respect. Now Aaron saw the rot that had been growing beneath the surface. "Pack your things," Aaron told Crystal. "Both of you." Miranda finally turned, her Botox-frozen forehead unable to furrow despite her confusion. "What are you talking about? You burned my daughter. Your son thinks it's funny. I'm done. Your daughter." Brian stepped forward, his 6-foot frame trying to intimidate. "She's not your blood, old man. None of us are." Aaron's smile was colder than a Montana winter. "You're right. And you just reminded me why that matters." As Crystal gathered her few belongings, Aaron made a phone call to his lawyer, Carl Welch, then another to his accountant, Stuart Hunter. By morning, the wheels would be in motion. Miranda laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "You think you can just leave? I'll take half of everything you've built, Aaron. I know about the offshore accounts, the shell companies. My lawyer will destroy you." Aaron's expression didn't change. He had built his fortune through calculation, patience, and the ability to see 10 moves ahead. Miranda had just revealed she'd been digging into his finances, something that explained certain discrepancies he'd noticed in his accounts. "We'll see," was all he said. That night, Aaron and Crystal checked into a hotel suite downtown. As Crystal slept, exhausted from pain and emotional trauma, Aaron sat on the balcony overlooking the city he had helped build. Construction cranes bearing his company's logo dotted the skyline like metal sentinels. He thought about Miranda's confidence, her smug certainty that she held all the cards. She had clearly been planning this for a while, probably encouraged by someone who knew enough about divorce proceedings to feel bold. Aaron pulled out his phone and scrolled through Miranda's contacts, something he'd memorized years ago out of protective instinct. One name stood out: Seth Flowers, Miranda's personal trainer, who had been making frequent appearances in their home while Aaron worked. A few discreet phone calls to his security contacts revealed what he'd suspected. Miranda and Seth had been carrying on an affair for over a year. The trainer, a failed actor turned fitness instructor, had expensive tastes and mounting debts. Aaron smiled as he pieced together the puzzle. Seth had been feeding Miranda information about asset protection and divorce strategies, probably from his own experience with a messy divorce from his first wife. They had been planning to take Aaron for everything he was worth. But Aaron Haley had been playing games of strategy since he was a child, surviving in Chicago's toughest neighborhoods. These suburban schemers had no idea who they were dealing with. As dawn broke over the city, Aaron began making a list, not of assets to protect or lawyers to call, but of pressure points and weaknesses. Every person had them, triggers that could unravel their entire world if pressed correctly. Miranda loved her social status and her position as a respected member of the country club set. Seth craved legitimacy and acceptance in circles that had always looked down on him. Brian depended on his mother's support and his stepfather's connections to maintain his lifestyle. Aaron had given them everything. Now he would take it all back, piece by piece, and watch them destroy themselves in the process. The game was about to begin. Chapter 2, The Discovery. 3 days after the iron incident, Aaron sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the Haley building, reviewing the intelligence his private investigator had gathered. Todd Mayer was the best in the business, a former FBI agent who specialized in corporate espionage and domestic investigations. "It's worse than we thought," Todd said, sliding a thick folder across Aaron's mahogany desk. "The affair started 14 months ago. Seth Flowers isn't just her trainer. He's been positioning himself as her business advisor." Aaron opened the folder, his face remaining impassive as he reviewed photographs, financial records, and recorded conversations. Miranda and Seth had been meeting regularly at the Riverside Hotel, but they'd also been conducting meetings with lawyers, real estate agents, and investment advisors. "They've been planning the divorce for months," Todd continued. "Seth convinced her to start documenting your emotional abuse and controlling behavior. She's been building a case for spousal abuse to maximize her settlement." The irony wasn't lost on Aaron. While Miranda crafted false narratives of abuse, she had literally branded his daughter with a hot iron. "There's more," Todd said, producing a second set of documents. "Seth owes money to some very unpleasant people. His gambling debts total close to $200,000, and his creditors aren't the type to accept payment plans." Aaron studied a surveillance photo of Seth meeting with 2 men outside a casino. Even from a distance, their body language screamed intimidation. "Your wife has been secretly liquidating assets to help pay his debts," Todd continued. "She sold jewelry, took cash advances on credit cards, even borrowed against your daughter's college fund." Aaron's jaw tightened. Crystal had been working herself to exhaustion, believing she needed to save every penny for nursing school, while her mother stole from her future to fund her affair. The investigation revealed more disturbing details. Brian wasn't just complicit in his mother's schemes. He was actively participating. The boy had been feeding Seth information about Aaron's business dealings, using his access to the family's private spaces to photograph documents and record conversations. "Brian's been promised a partnership in a new business venture," Todd explained. "Seth convinced Miranda that you'd never put the boy in your will as a real son, so they needed to secure his future independently." Aaron pulled up Brian's financial records on his computer. The boy had been living far beyond his means. Expensive clothes, restaurant bills, a BMW lease that cost more than most people's mortgages, all funded by credit cards that Miranda co-signed. The family Aaron had built and protected for 15 years had been systematically betraying him while he worked himself to exhaustion providing for them. But the deepest cut came in the final pages of Todd's report. Audio recordings from the house, obtained through security cameras Aaron had installed for protection, revealed conversations between Miranda and Brian about Crystal. "She's not even his real daughter," Miranda's voice crackled through the speakers. "And she's always been a pathetic little mouse. Aaron only keeps her around out of guilt." Brian's laughter followed. "She'll never amount to anything anyway. Might as well put her in her place now." Aaron had heard enough. He dismissed Todd and sat alone in his office as the sun set over the city. From his window, he could see the construction site where his latest project was taking shape, a medical complex that would employ hundreds and serve thousands. He thought about his own childhood, growing up in poverty with an alcoholic father and a mother who worked 3 jobs to keep them housed and fed. Every success, Every achievement had been earned through blood, sweat, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Miranda came from privilege, but had squandered every opportunity. Seth was a parasite who targeted successful people to fund his failures. Brian had been handed every advantage, but chose entitlement over effort. They had confused Aaron's generosity for weakness, his love for stupidity. Now, they would learn the difference between a provider and a predator. Aaron made his first call to Randall Dotson, a lawyer who specialized in asset protection and complex corporate structures. The second call went to Clay Abbott, a real estate developer who had been trying to buy one of Aaron's prime properties for years. By midnight, Aaron had restructured his entire financial empire. Shell companies were dissolved, assets were transferred, and ownership structures were reorganized. Miranda would find that the money she thought she could claim had vanished like smoke. But financial protection was just the beginning. Aaron's Real plan required patience, precision, and a deep understanding of human psychology. He pulled up the contact information for Enrique McCormick, the best private security consultant on the West Coast. Enrique had helped Aaron deal with union disputes and corporate sabotage in the past, but this job would require more creative solutions. The final call went to Mark Mead, a media consultant who specialized in reputation management. Aaron had a story to tell, and he wanted to make sure it reached the right audiences at the right time. As Aaron left his office that night, he stopped by the construction site where it all began. 23 years ago, he had started with nothing but a pickup truck and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. Every building, every success, every dollar had been earned through determination and strategic thinking. Miranda, Seth, and Brian thought they were playing checkers. They had no idea Aaron had already begun a game of chess where he controlled every piece on the board. The first move had been made when they chose betrayal over loyalty. Now Aaron would show them how a real strategist plays to win. Chapter 3. The Foundation. Aaron stood in the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, watching as Enrique McCormick's team set up surveillance equipment and communication systems. The building, officially condemned and scheduled for demolition, would serve as headquarters for what Aaron privately called Operation Reset. The beauty of this location, Enrique explained as he tested camera feeds, is that it doesn't exist on paper anymore. City records show it was demolished last month. Aaron nodded, appreciating the irony. Like his marriage, this building appeared intact on the surface while being fundamentally destroyed underneath. Crystal sat at a makeshift desk, her bandaged arm resting carefully as she reviewed documents. Despite her pain, she had insisted on helping with the research. The burn mark would fade, but her trust in family had been permanently scarred. "I found something interesting about Seth's background," she said, holding up a file. "His real name is Seth Flowers, but he used to go by Stephen Fletcher when he was married to his first wife." Aaron examined the documents. Seth had changed his name after a messy divorce that left him bankrupt and facing assault charges. Charges that were dropped when his ex-wife mysteriously withdrew her complaint and left the state. "There's a pattern here," Crystal continued. "He targets older women, usually divorced or widowed, with substantial assets. Miranda is his third mark in 5 years." The research revealed Seth's methodology: establish himself as a fitness trainer at upscale gyms, identify wealthy female clients going through emotional transitions, and slowly insert himself into their lives as both lover and financial advisor. His first victim lost her house, Crystal read from the file. The second one ended up declaring bankruptcy. Seth always manages to walk away clean while they lose everything. Aaron felt a cold satisfaction as the pieces fell into place. Seth wasn't just an opportunistic parasite. He was a career predator who had chosen the wrong target. Mark Mead arrived at noon with a van full of video equipment and a team of journalists who specialized in investigative exposés. Aaron had hired them to document everything, but not for the reasons anyone expected. "The story you want to tell," Mark explained as his team set up cameras, "isn't about revenge. It's about protection. You're a successful businessman whose family was infiltrated by a con artist, and you're taking steps to protect other potential victims." The narrative was perfect. Aaron would be seen as a concerned citizen exposing a dangerous criminal, not a husband seeking vengeance. The documentation would serve multiple purposes: evidence for legal proceedings, material for public exposure, and insurance against any attempts by Miranda and Seth to rewrite history. That afternoon, Aaron met with Willard Sweeney, a forensic accountant who had helped him navigate complex business deals in the past. Willard had been analyzing Miranda's financial activities, and the results were damning. "She's been systematically embezzling from your personal accounts," Willard reported. "Small amounts at first, but increasing over time. The total is approaching 6 figures. "That's not embezzlement," Aaron corrected. "Those are joint accounts. Legally, she had every right to withdraw that money." Willard smiled. "Not if the funds were being used to commit fraud or support criminal activities. Seth's gambling debts aren't just markers at legitimate casinos. He owes money to loan sharks connected to organized crime." The distinction was crucial. Miranda thought she was funding an affair, but she was actually laundering money for criminal enterprises. The federal implications would multiply her legal exposure exponentially. As evening approached, Aaron received updates from his various team members. Stuart Hunter reported that the financial restructuring was complete. Miranda would find that her access to Aaron's wealth had vanished overnight. Carl Welch confirmed that divorce papers were being prepared with terms that would shock Miranda's legal team. But the most interesting update came from Jimmy Nichols, a private investigator who specialized in background checks for Aaron's construction company. Jimmy had been researching Brian's activities and discovered something unexpected. "Your stepson has been selling information about your business dealings," Jimmy reported. "But not just to Seth. He's been in contact with competitors, union organizers, and at least 2 government investigators." Aaron felt a familiar coldness settle in his chest. Brian's betrayal went far beyond family disloyalty. It was corporate espionage that could have destroyed Aaron's business and put hundreds of people out of work. "There's more," Jimmy continued. "He's been using his access to your home office to photograph sensitive documents. Some of those photos ended up in the hands of people who've been trying to undermine your contract for years." The revelation added a new dimension to Aaron's plans. Brian wasn't just a spoiled child supporting his mother's affair. He was actively sabotaging the business that had paid for his education, his car, and his lifestyle. As Aaron reviewed all the intelligence gathered over the past week, he began to see the full scope of the conspiracy against him. Miranda, Seth, and Brian had been working together to destroy him systematically while positioning themselves to profit from the wreckage. They had underestimated him completely. Aaron had built his empire by understanding that every problem contained the seeds of its own solution. Every weakness in an enemy's plan created an opportunity for counterattack. Aaron opened his laptop and began typing detailed instructions for each member of his team. The plan he was implementing would unfold over several weeks, with each phase building on the previous one until his enemies found themselves trapped in a web of their own making. The first phase would target their finances and social standing. The second would expose their crimes and betrayals. The third would ensure they faced consequences that would last for years. Aaron had learned long ago that mercy was often mistaken for weakness, and forgiveness was frequently repaid with fresh betrayal. He had given Miranda, Seth, and Brian every opportunity to choose loyalty over greed, family over self-interest. They had made their choice. Now Aaron would show them the consequences of betraying someone who had clawed his way out of poverty and built an empire through sheer force of will. The foundation for their destruction was complete. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Chapter 4: The Pressure Points. Miranda Caldwell woke up to discover that her credit cards had been canceled overnight. When she called the bank to complain, she was transferred to a supervisor who informed her that Mr. Haley had restructured all accounts and removed her as an authorized user. "That's impossible," Miranda shrieked into the phone. "I'm his wife. I have rights." "Ma'am, according to our records, these were business accounts that Mr. Haley personally guaranteed. He has every legal right to manage access to his own credit facilities." Miranda threw the phone across her bedroom, barely missing the mirror that reflected her rage-contorted face. She called Seth immediately, but his phone went straight to voicemail. What Miranda didn't know was that Seth was sitting in a parking garage across town, staring at two men who had paid him a very unfriendly visit. His gambling debts had come due, and his creditors weren't interested in excuses. 2 weeks, the larger man said, adjusting his brass knuckles. You get us our money in 2 weeks, or we start collecting in other ways. Seth's hands shook as he tried calling Miranda, but her phone was busy. He didn't know that Aaron's team had been monitoring his communications and had arranged for both problems to surface simultaneously. Meanwhile, Brian Raymond was having his own crisis at his downtown apartment. His BMW had been repossessed in the night, and his landlord was demanding 3 months of back rent that Brian couldn't pay. His mother's credit cards, which had been funding his lifestyle, were no longer working. This is all Aaron's fault, Brian muttered, throwing his clothes into garbage bags. His expensive wardrobe, paid for with Aaron's money, was all he had left of value. But Brian's problems were just beginning. At his part-time job as a consultant for his mother's social circle, he discovered that word had somehow spread about his disloyalty to Aaron. In the tight-knit business community Aaron had spent decades building, Brian found himself persona non grata overnight. Aaron watched the chaos unfold from his command center in the warehouse, where multiple screens showed surveillance feeds, news reports, and financial data. Crystal sat beside him, her healing arm no longer hindering her ability to coordinate the operation. Seth's creditors are increasing pressure, she reported, monitoring communications intercepts. He's desperate enough to do something stupid. That stupidity came sooner than expected. Seth broke into Miranda's house that afternoon, searching for jewelry and valuables he could liquidate quickly. What he found instead was Aaron, sitting calmly in the living room with a cup of coffee. Hello, Seth. Looking for something? Seth froze, a gold necklace halfway into his pocket. Miranda said I could. Miranda says a lot of things, Aaron replied, his voice conversational. Most of them lies. Would you like to sit down? We should talk. The conversation that followed was recorded by hidden cameras that Aaron's team had installed throughout the house. Seth, panicked about his debts and desperate for solutions, admitted to everything. The affair, the financial planning, the scheme to take Aaron's assets, even Brian's role as an informant. She promised me half of everything, Seth said, his desperation making him careless. The business, the houses, the investments. Miranda said you were stupid and weak, that you'd never see it coming. Aaron nodded sympathetically. And what did you promise her in return? A new life. Freedom from a husband who never appreciated her. Seth's voice took on a rehearsed quality, as if he'd practiced these lines. She deserves better than someone who just works all the time. I see. And Brian? What role does he play in this new life? Seth shifted uncomfortably. The kid's useful. He has access to your files, your computer. We needed someone inside to make sure we didn't miss anything valuable. Every word was being recorded in high definition, creating a permanent record of the conspiracy. Aaron had what he needed, but he wasn't finished yet. There's just one problem with your plan, Aaron said, still speaking in the same calm tone. You assumed I was stupid and weak. What if you were wrong? The realization dawned slowly on Seth's face as he noticed the cameras, the recording equipment, the fact that Aaron was completely relaxed despite catching him in the act of burglary. This was a setup, Seth whispered. This was justice, Aaron corrected. You're a career criminal who targets vulnerable women. Miranda isn't your first victim, and she wouldn't have been your last. Aaron stood up, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the trembling younger man. But she will be your last, because I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what you are. That evening, Aaron's team executed the next phase of the plan. The recorded confession was edited into a documentary-style presentation and sent to every member of Miranda's social circle, every client at Seth Gym, and every business associate who had ever dealt with Brian. The response was immediate and devastating. Miranda's country club friends stopped taking her calls. Seth's training clients canceled their sessions and demanded refunds. Brian's consulting work dried up as word spread about his corporate espionage. But Aaron wasn't content with social exile. He wanted complete destruction. The security footage of Seth burglarizing the house was delivered to the police, along with evidence of his fraud, gambling debts, and connections to organized crime. The audio recordings of Brian discussing corporate secrets were forwarded to federal investigators who had been monitoring Aaron's business for years, looking for any excuse to bring him down. Now those same investigators had evidence that Aaron was the victim, not the perpetrator, of corporate espionage. Miranda received divorce papers that evening, along with a complete accounting of her theft from family accounts. The documents, prepared by Carl Welch, were masterpieces of legal precision that left her with virtually no claim to Aaron's assets. "Irreconcilable differences," she read aloud, her voice rising with each word. "He's claiming irreconcilable differences because I disciplined my own daughter?" Brian, now homeless and facing federal investigation, tried to rally his mother. "We can fight this. We can expose his business dealings, his offshore accounts." "With what money?" Miranda snapped. "Our lawyer won't even take our calls. Without a retainer we can't pay." As mother and son faced the collapse of their schemes, Aaron was already planning the next phase. Financial and social destruction was satisfying, but he wanted them to understand the full consequences of their betrayal. The real pain was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Squeeze. The Riverside Hotel, where Miranda and Seth had conducted their affair, became the setting for Seth's downfall. Aaron had purchased the failing business through one of his shell companies, and the new management was very interested in investigating irregularities in their previous operations. Security footage from the past year was mysteriously discovered and turned over to law enforcement, showing Seth and Miranda's meetings, but also revealing something more damaging: Seth's drug transactions with hotel guests and staff. "We had no idea," the new manager told reporters as Channel 7 news cameras rolled. "When Mr. Haley's company acquired this property, we immediately began reviewing security procedures and discovered evidence of serious criminal activity." Seth watched the news report from a seedy motel room, his world collapsing around him. The drug charges were secondary to his real problem. His gambling creditors had seen the same news report and correctly concluded that he would never be able to pay them. Miranda fared no better. Her attempt to claim spousal support was demolished in court when Aaron's lawyers presented evidence of her theft, adultery, and abuse of Crystal. The judge, a woman with little patience for child abusers, awarded Aaron full custody of Crystal and ordered Miranda to pay restitution. "Your Honor," Miranda's court-appointed lawyer pleaded, "my client has no income and no assets with which to pay restitution." Then perhaps she should have considered that before stealing from her daughter's college fund and burning the child with a hot iron. Judge Diane Quinn replied coldly. Brian's situation was even worse. The federal investigation into his corporate espionage had expanded to include his connections to Seth's criminal activities. Prosecutors were offering him a plea deal that would require him to testify against his mother and Seth in exchange for a reduced sentence. "They want me to wear a wire," Brian told Miranda during one of their few remaining conversations. "They think you and Seth are part of some larger conspiracy." Miranda laughed bitterly. "Conspiracy? We couldn't even pull off a simple divorce without everything falling apart." What neither Miranda nor Brian understood was that their failures weren't due to bad luck or poor planning. They were the result of Aaron's systematic destruction of every foundation they had built their schemes upon. Aaron had used his business connections to ensure that Miranda couldn't find employment anywhere in the city. Seth's gym had fired him after clients complained about the criminal charges, and his personal training license was under review. Brian's reputation in the business community was so thoroughly destroyed that he couldn't even get hired as a delivery driver. But Aaron's masterpiece was yet to come. Through his media consultant Mark Mead, Aaron had been building a narrative about Seth as a serial predator who targeted vulnerable women. The story was picked up by national news outlets, with Miranda portrayed as Seth's latest victim rather than his willing accomplice. She was brainwashed by a master manipulator, one expert explained on television. These predators are skilled at identifying women going through difficult transitions and exploiting their emotional vulnerability. The narrative served Aaron's purposes perfectly. It painted Miranda as a victim rather than a villain, which made her actual crimes seem even more shocking when they were eventually revealed. Public sympathy for a brainwashed woman would quickly turn to disgust when people learned she had burned her own daughter. Seth, meanwhile, was dealing with more immediate problems. His creditors had escalated from threats to action, vandalizing his car and following him to his new job at a discount fitness center. When he tried to flee the city, he was arrested at the airport on the drug charges stemming from the hotel investigation. Bail is set at $500,000, the judge announced, knowing full well that Seth had no way to raise such an amount. From his jail cell, Seth tried to contact Miranda, hoping she might have access to funds that could help him. What he didn't know was that Miranda was facing her own legal crisis. Aaron had filed a civil lawsuit against Miranda for theft, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit, designed more for publicity than recovery, detailed every aspect of her betrayal and included graphic photos of Crystal's burn injuries. Local newspapers picked up the story, and Miranda found herself cast as a child abuser and gold digger who had stolen from her own daughter to fund an affair with a career criminal. The evidence shows a pattern of calculated cruelty, Aaron's lawyer told reporters. Ms. Caldwell didn't just betray her husband. She systematically abused and exploited the children in her care. Miranda's attempts to generate sympathy were undermined by her own recorded words, which Aaron's team strategically leaked to media outlets. Her laughter as Crystal writhed in pain, her casual dismissal of the injury, and her cruel comments about her daughter's worth destroyed any chance of public support. Brian's situation deteriorated further when prosecutors offered him immunity in exchange for testimony against his mother. The federal charges related to corporate espionage carried potential sentences of up to 20 years, making cooperation his only realistic option. "She's my mother," Brian protested to his lawyer. "She's also the reason you're facing federal charges," the lawyer replied bluntly. "She encouraged you to steal from the man who raised you, educated you, and treated you as his own son. Now that man is willing to let you walk away if you tell the truth about what happened." The truth, Brian discovered, was more damaging than he had realized. Aaron's investigators had documented every aspect of the conspiracy, from the initial affair to the planned asset seizure. Brian's cooperation would simply confirm what Aaron already knew and had extensively documented. As the legal proceedings moved forward, Aaron continued his campaign of systematic destruction. He used his influence to ensure that Miranda's story reached the attention of child welfare organizations, women's advocacy groups, and victim rights activists. The irony was deliberate. Miranda had expected to portray herself as a victim of Aaron's alleged abuse, but instead found herself condemned by the very groups she had hoped would support her. Seth, still in jail and facing mounting pressure from both prosecutors and creditors, finally agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for protective custody. His confession included detailed testimony about Miranda's role in planning the asset seizure and Brian's corporate espionage activities. "She wasn't a victim," Seth told prosecutors, abandoning his former lover to save himself. "She was the ringleader. The whole thing was her idea from the beginning." Aaron watched the dominoes fall from his office, overlooking the city he had helped build. Each revelation, each betrayal, each desperate attempt to escape consequences only deepened the hole his enemies had dug for themselves. But he wasn't finished yet. The final phase of his plan would ensure that their destruction was permanent and complete. Chapter 6: The Revelation. The courtroom was packed with media, social activists, and curious onlookers as Miranda Caldwell's trial began. Aaron sat in the front row beside Crystal, whose healed arm bore only a faint scar, but whose testimony would be devastating. District Attorney Freddie Mullen had built his case methodically, using the mountain of evidence Aaron's team had gathered. The charges included child abuse, theft, fraud, and conspiracy, a combination that could result in decades in prison. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Mullen began his opening statement, "this case is about the systematic abuse and exploitation of a family by someone they trusted completely. The defendant didn't just burn her daughter with a hot iron. She orchestrated a complex scheme to destroy the man who had provided for her family for 15 years. Miranda's defense attorney, an overworked public defender named Guadalupe Green, tried to maintain the narrative that Miranda had been manipulated by Seth. But that strategy crumbled when prosecutors revealed recordings of Miranda discussing the scheme before she had ever met Seth. The first bombshell came from Brian's testimony. In exchange for immunity, he had agreed to reveal everything, including details that Aaron hadn't previously known. She started planning to leave Aaron about 2 years ago, Brian testified, avoiding his mother's furious glare. But she wanted to make sure she got as much money as possible. She researched his business, talked to lawyers, even hired a private investigator to look for evidence of affairs or financial crimes. The revelation that Miranda had been planning her betrayal for years, long before Seth appeared, destroyed any sympathy the jury might have felt for her. But the most shocking testimony came from an unexpected source. Ethel Lancaster, Crystal's biological grandmother, who had remained silent for years about her daughter-in-law's true nature. "Miranda called me 3 years ago," the elderly woman testified, her voice shaking with emotion. "She wanted to know if Crystal had any inheritance coming from her father's side. When I told her there wasn't anything significant, she said, 'Then the little bitch is worthless to me.'" The courtroom erupted at this revelation. Miranda had been calculating Crystal's financial value to her even before the affair began, treating her stepdaughter as nothing more than a potential asset. Crystal's own testimony was the most powerful moment of the trial. She described not just the burning incident, but years of emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and deliberate sabotage of her education and career goals. "She told me I wasn't smart enough for college," Crystal said, her voice steady despite her tears. "She said Aaron was wasting money on my education because I'd never amount to anything. But she was spending that same money on clothes, jewelry, and trips with Seth." Aaron watched Miranda's face as Crystal spoke, seeing no remorse or regret, only anger at being exposed. Even facing prison, Miranda couldn't summon any genuine emotion for the daughter she had tortured. The prosecution's case was devastating, but Aaron had one final surprise prepared. Through his connections in law enforcement, he had learned that Seth's criminal history went back much further than anyone had realized. Detective Reginald Drake took the stand to reveal that Seth had been connected to at least 5 other cases involving fraud against older women, including one that had resulted in a woman's suicide when she lost her life savings. The defendant's affair wasn't just adultery, Drake testified. It was part of a pattern of financial predation that has destroyed lives across 3 states. The revelation that Miranda had unknowingly partnered with a serial killer of dreams, someone whose schemes had literally driven a woman to suicide, shocked even Aaron. He had expected to find a garden-variety predator, not someone whose crimes had such devastating consequences. Miranda's lawyer tried desperately to salvage the case by arguing that her client had been manipulated by a master criminal, but the recorded conversations between Miranda and Seth told a different story. In them, Miranda was clearly the dominant partner, directing Seth's actions and making strategic decisions. She wasn't a victim, Seth testified via video link from federal prison, having already been convicted on multiple counts. "She was smarter than me, more ruthless. The iron thing was all her idea." She said Crystal needed to learn respect. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, their verdict was swift and decisive, guilty on all counts. Judge Quinn's sentencing was equally harsh. "Ms. Caldwell, you have shown a level of cruelty and calculation that shocks the conscience. You burned your own daughter, stole from her future, and conspired to destroy the man who treated you and your children as family. The court sentences you to 25 years in prison without possibility of parole for 15 years. Miranda collapsed as the sentence was read, finally understanding that her schemes had not just failed, they had destroyed her completely. Aaron felt no satisfaction in her tears. Justice had been served, but the damage to his family could never be fully repaired. As they left the courthouse, Crystal squeezed Aaron's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Aaron looked at the young woman who had emerged stronger from her ordeal, now preparing to start nursing school with his full support. "You're my daughter," he said. "That means something to me, even if it didn't to her." The media coverage of the trial had an unexpected consequence. Several other women came forward with stories of being targeted by men using Seth's methods. Aaron found himself inadvertently leading a campaign to expose financial predators who targeted vulnerable women. But privately, Aaron was already moving on to the next phase of his life. With Miranda and Seth in prison and Brian facing his own consequences, he was free to build something new with Crystal, a family based on loyalty, respect, and genuine affection. The old Aaron might have felt guilty about the ruthless efficiency of his revenge, but that Aaron had been too trusting, too forgiving. The new Aaron understood that some betrayals could never be forgiven, and some people deserved exactly what they brought upon themselves. Justice, Aaron had learned, wasn't always pretty, but it was always necessary. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. 6 months after Miranda's sentencing, Aaron stood in the construction site of the Crystal Haley Medical Center, a trauma treatment facility he was building in his daughter's honor. The irony wasn't lost on him that a building dedicated to healing would rise from the ashes of such destruction. Crystal had thrived since the trial, excelling in her nursing program and working part-time at the Children's Hospital. The burn scar on her arm had faded to a thin white line, but the strength she had gained from surviving her ordeal was permanent. The Psychological Evaluation Center will be on the 3rd floor, Crystal explained to Aaron as they reviewed architectural plans, specifically designed for children who've suffered abuse. Aaron nodded, proud of how his daughter had transformed her trauma into purpose. The medical center would serve as a permanent reminder that suffering could create something meaningful if channeled correctly. Brian had fared differently. After serving 18 months in federal prison for corporate espionage, he was released to a world that had moved on without him. His cooperation with prosecutors had kept him from a longer sentence, but it had also branded him as a traitor in both legitimate and criminal circles. Aaron had ensured that Brian's cooperation became public knowledge, making him unemployable in any field requiring trust or discretion. The young man who had once lived luxuriously on Aaron's generosity now worked minimum wage jobs and lived in a studio apartment on the wrong side of town. "He called me yesterday," Crystal told Aaron as they drove home from the construction site. "He wanted to know if you'd ever forgive him." Aaron's expression didn't change. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That forgiveness has to be earned, and he's never even apologized for what he did to either of us." Brian's downfall had been more complete than even Aaron had planned. The federal conviction made him ineligible for most professional licenses, and his betrayal of Aaron had destroyed his reputation in the business community. More importantly, his testimony against his mother had fractured his remaining family relationships. Miranda's relatives had cut all contact with Brian after learning the extent of his cooperation with prosecutors. In trying to save himself, he had lost both his adoptive and biological families, leaving him truly alone. Seth's fate had been even harsher. His connections to organized crime made prison a dangerous place for him, and his cooperation with prosecutors had made him a target. He spent most of his time in protective custody, isolated from other inmates, and facing decades behind bars. But Aaron's most satisfying victory wasn't the destruction of his enemies. It was the construction of something better in their place. The Haley Foundation, established with Crystal as co-director, had become a major force in supporting abuse victims and funding education for underprivileged children. The foundation's work ensured that Aaron's wealth would create positive change long after he was gone. Aaron had also restructured his business to include employee ownership programs and community investment initiatives. The company that Miranda had tried to loot was now benefiting hundreds of families and strengthening the community Aaron called home. "There's something else," Crystal said as they reached home, a new house Aaron had built for them, free from the memories of Miranda's abuse. "I've been accepted to the pediatric nursing program at Johns Hopkins." Aaron felt a surge of pride that surpassed any business success he had ever achieved. Crystal had not only survived her ordeal, but was positioning herself to help other children who face similar trauma. "When do you start?" he asked. "Next fall, but I want to finish the medical center project first. I want to see it completed." That evening, Aaron sat in his study reviewing reports from Todd Mayer, who continued to monitor Miranda and Seth's situations. Both were adapting poorly to prison life, and their appeals had been unanimously rejected by higher courts. Miranda had lost significant weight and was receiving psychological treatment for depression. Her request for early release had been denied, and her earliest possible parole date was still a decade away. Seth faced even grimmer prospects. His gambling debts had followed him into prison, and his creditors had connections throughout the correctional system. He lived in constant fear, dependent on guards for protection, and facing the possibility that his debts might be collected through violence. But the most interesting development involved Brian. Todd's surveillance revealed that the young man had been attempting to reconnect with his biological father, Thomas Lancaster, who had abandoned the family years earlier. Thomas wants nothing to do with him, Todd reported. Apparently, Brian tried to convince his father to help him get revenge against you. Thomas called Brian a pathetic loser and hung up on him. Aaron wasn't surprised. Brian had spent years believing he was entitled to loyalty and support from people he had betrayed. The reality that actions had consequences was still foreign to him. There's one more thing, Todd continued. Brian has been trying to contact journalists about writing a tell-all book about your criminal empire. He's claiming you framed him and his mother. Aaron smiled coldly. And how is that working out for him? No one's interested. Your reputation in the community is too strong, and Brian's credibility is too damaged. Plus, he signed confidentiality agreements as part of his plea deal that would land him back in federal prison if he violates them. The final irony was perfect. Brian's desperation for revenge against Aaron was limited by the very cooperation agreement that had saved him from a longer prison sentence. He was trapped by his own choices, unable to move forward or backward. As Aaron prepared for bed, he reflected on how completely the landscape had changed. A year ago, he had been a successful but naive man who believed that love and generosity would be returned in kind. Now he was a strategist who understood that trust was earned, loyalty was tested, and betrayal was met with overwhelming force. Crystal found him on the balcony, looking out over the city lights. "Any regrets?" she asked. Aaron considered the question carefully. "About the methods? No. About the necessity? Yes. I regret that it had to come to this. Do you think they've learned anything?" Aaron shook his head. Miranda blames everyone but herself. Seth is focused on survival. Brian still thinks he's the victim. None of them understand that they created their own destruction. Crystal nodded, understanding that some people were incapable of growth or redemption. "Then you made the right choice." As they stood together in comfortable silence, Aaron knew that his campaign of justice had accomplished more than revenge. It had revealed the true character of everyone involved. Miranda, Seth, and Brian had shown themselves to be exactly what Aaron now knew them to be: selfish, cruel, and fundamentally weak people who would betray anyone for personal gain. Aaron had learned to be something different, strong enough to protect what mattered, smart enough to anticipate threats, and ruthless enough to eliminate them completely. The game was over. Aaron had won not just victory, but transformation. Chapter 8. The New Order. 2 years after Miranda's conviction, Aaron stood before the city council as they voted unanimously to name the new Children's Crisis Center in Crystal's honor. The Crystal Haley Center for Child Advocacy had become the premier facility in the region for treating young abuse victims, funded entirely by Aaron's foundation. "Mr. Haley," Mayor Alyssa Holder said as she presented him with the key to the city, "your generosity has transformed how our community protects its most vulnerable citizens." Aaron accepted the honor, knowing that his reputation had been completely rehabilitated. The narrative of the wronged father who had protected his daughter and exposed dangerous criminals had overshadowed any questions about his methods. Crystal, now finishing her pediatric nursing degree, had become a public advocate for abuse victims. Her story, burning, betrayal, and ultimate triumph, inspired other survivors to come forward and seek help. "The most important thing I learned," Crystal told a conference of social workers, "is that healing requires justice. Victims can't move forward when their abusers face no consequences." Brian watched Crystal's speech on a laptop in his cramped apartment, his face twisted with resentment. At 27, He looked older than his age, worn down by minimum wage jobs and the constant struggle to survive without the support system he had destroyed. His attempts to rebuild his life had failed repeatedly. Every job application that required a background check revealed his federal conviction. Every potential relationship ended when partners learned about his betrayal of his family. Even his attempts to change his name had been blocked by legal restrictions related to his conviction. Brian had recently been evicted from his apartment and was living in his car, a 15-year-old Honda that had replaced the BMW Aaron once provided. His descent into homelessness seemed inevitable unless something changed. Miranda's situation was equally bleak, but more stable. Prison had stripped away her pretenses and forced her to confront the reality of her choices. She worked in the prison laundry for 17 cents an hour and spent her evenings in her cell, writing letters to Aaron and Crystal that were never sent. She talks about them constantly. Her cellmate, a woman named Robin Hahn, told the prison counselor. She's convinced that if she could just explain herself, they'd forgive her and take her back. The delusion that Miranda maintained, that she was the victim of a misunderstanding rather than the architect of her own destruction, had become a form of mental protection. Accepting responsibility for burning her daughter and destroying her family would have required her to acknowledge a level of evil she couldn't face. Seth's prison experience had been more harrowing. His protective custody status made him a target for guards and inmates alike, and his gambling debts had followed him behind bars. He lived in constant fear, knowing that his creditors had connections throughout the prison system. He's basically serving a death sentence, his lawyer told reporters. The protective custody unit is just delaying the inevitable. Aaron monitored these developments through his network of contacts, but felt no sympathy for any of his former family members. They had made their choices when they chose betrayal over loyalty, cruelty over compassion. The business Aaron had built continued to thrive under his leadership, but he had restructured it to prevent future betrayals. Key positions were filled by people whose loyalty had been tested over years, and access to sensitive information was strictly controlled. More importantly, Aaron had learned to trust his instincts about people. The signs of Miranda's true nature had been there from the beginning. Her casual cruelty to service workers, her obsession with social status, her lack of empathy for others' struggles. Aaron had ignored these red flags because he wanted to believe in the family he was building. Now he understood that character was revealed through actions, not words, and that past behavior was the most reliable predictor of future choices. "You've become harder," Crystal observed one evening as they reviewed foundation business. "Not cruel, but more realistic about people." Aaron nodded. "Experience teaches lessons that theory never could. I learned that some people will take everything you give them and still want more." The lesson had applications beyond his personal life. Aaron's business dealings had become more cautious, his contracts more detailed, his trust more carefully earned. He had learned to distinguish between partners and parasites, between temporary setbacks and fundamental character flaws. The most unexpected development had been Aaron's emergence as a mentor to other men facing similar betrayals. His story had resonated with countless husbands and fathers who had been taken advantage of by people they trusted. The key, Aaron told a support group of divorced men, is understanding that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. You can forgive someone for your own peace of mind while still protecting yourself from future harm. Several group members had been pressured by family and friends to forgive and forget spouses who had betrayed them. Aaron's example showed them that they could move forward without compromising their principles or enabling continued abuse. Forgiveness without consequences is just enabling, Aaron continued. Real forgiveness requires accountability, and accountability requires consequences. The support group had grown into a network of men who helped each other navigate divorce, custody battles, and financial disputes. Aaron's influence had created a community of people who understood that strength wasn't measured by how much abuse you could tolerate, but by how effectively you could protect what mattered. As Aaron's reputation as a protector and advocate grew, he began receiving requests for help from people facing situations similar to his own. The foundation expanded its mission to include support for anyone being exploited by family members or trusted friends. "We're not vigilantes," Aaron explained to his staff. "We're educators. We help people understand their legal rights, their financial options, and their personal boundaries." But Aaron's definition of education was broader than most people's. When a widow contacted the foundation about her son's theft of her retirement savings, Aaron's team didn't just provide legal referrals. They conducted a comprehensive investigation that revealed the son's gambling addiction and drug dealing. When a single mother reported that her ex-husband was coaching their children to lie in custody proceedings, Aaron's investigators documented the manipulation and presented evidence that led to supervised visitation requirements. In each case, Aaron applied the same principles he had used against Miranda, Seth, and Brian. Comprehensive intelligence gathering, strategic patience, and overwhelming response to confirmed threats. "You're building an empire," Crystal observed as she reviewed the foundation's expanded operations. "I'm building protection," Aaron corrected, "for people who can't protect themselves." The distinction was important to Aaron. His campaign against Miranda had been personal revenge justified by their crimes. The foundation's work was preventive justice designed to stop future victims from suffering similar betrayals. But the methods were often identical: thorough investigation, strategic planning, and relentless execution until threats were neutralized completely. Aaron had learned that mercy was often mistaken for weakness, and weakness invited further exploitation. The world contained predators who viewed kindness as opportunity and trust as vulnerability. Against such people, overwhelming force was the only effective deterrent. The new Aaron Haley was no longer vulnerable to betrayal because he no longer relied on others' goodwill for his security. He had built systems, networks, and resources that could function independently of any individual's loyalty. It was a lonely form of strength, but it was unbreakable. Chapter 9. The Final Verdict. 5 years after the iron burned Crystal's arm, Aaron stood in the cemetery where his adoptive parents were buried, reflecting on how completely his life had changed. The naive man who had once believed that love and generosity would be naturally reciprocated was gone, replaced by someone who understood that respect was earned through strength. Crystal joined him at the gravesite, now a licensed pediatric nurse working at the children's hospital Aaron had endowed. She carried herself with confidence that came from surviving the worst betrayal imaginable and emerging stronger. "I got a letter from Brian yesterday," she said, handing Aaron an envelope. "He's asking for money." Aaron read the letter without surprise. Brian had been living in his car for 3 months and was desperate enough to beg for help from the family he had betrayed. The letter was full of self-pity and vague promises of changed behavior, but contained no genuine acknowledgement of his crimes or apology for his betrayal. "He says he's learned his lesson," Crystal continued. "He promises he's different now." Aaron tore the letter in half and dropped the pieces in a trash can. People like Brian only learn temporary lessons. As soon as the pressure is off, they revert to their true nature. The decision to refuse help wasn't cruel, it was educational. Brian needed to understand that actions had permanent consequences and that betrayal destroyed trust forever. Any assistance from Aaron would only teach Brian that his victims were weak enough to be exploited repeatedly. Miranda's situation had grown more desperate as her appeals continued to fail. Her lawyer had approached Aaron's representatives multiple times, suggesting that his testimony about her character might help with parole hearings. Aaron's response was always the same. Miranda had revealed her character through her actions, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change that reality. "She's still blaming everyone but herself," Crystal observed. "Her letters to me are full of complaints about the prison conditions and how unfairly she's been treated." Aaron wasn't surprised. Miranda's narcissism made it impossible for her to accept responsibility for her choices. She would spend the remainder of her sentence convinced that she was the victim of a conspiracy rather than the architect of her own destruction. Seth had finally met the violent end that everyone had anticipated. His gambling creditors had reached him despite protective custody, and he was found dead in his cell under circumstances that were officially ruled as suicide but clearly indicated otherwise. No great loss, Todd Mayer had reported when delivering the news. The world is safer without predators like him. Aaron felt no satisfaction in Seth's death, but no sadness either. The man had chosen to live as a parasite, destroying vulnerable people for personal gain. His violent end was simply the logical conclusion of a life spent making enemies. The foundation Aaron had built continued to expand its reach, helping hundreds of families avoid the kind of exploitation his own family had suffered. The work had given Aaron a sense of purpose that went beyond personal success or revenge. "We're opening a new facility in Portland," Crystal reported as they drove home from the cemetery. "A residential treatment center for children who've been abused by family members." Aaron nodded, pleased that his daughter had found a way to transform her trauma into positive change. Crystal's strength came not from forgetting what had happened to her, but from using that experience to protect others. "Any word from your grandmother?" Aaron asked. Crystal smiled. "She's doing well. Still grateful that you stood up for me when no one else would." Ethel Lancaster had become a strong supporter of the foundation after witnessing how Aaron had protected Crystal from further abuse. The elderly woman often spoke publicly about the importance of believing children and holding abusers accountable, regardless of family relationships. As they reached home, a fortress-like compound Aaron had built with state-of-the-art security systems, Crystal brought up a topic they had been discussing for months. "I've been thinking about changing my name legally," she said. "From Lancaster to Haley. You've been more of a father to me than anyone else ever was." Aaron felt a warmth that no business success had ever provided. "Are you sure? It's a big decision. You protected me when my own mother tried to destroy me," Crystal replied. "You've supported my dreams and helped me become the person I wanted to be. That makes you my real father, regardless of biology." The adoption paperwork was filed the following week, making Crystal officially Aaron's daughter in law as well as in love. The ceremony was small but meaningful, attended by friends and colleagues who had watched their relationship strengthen through adversity. Brian learned about the adoption through news coverage and sent another letter, this one filled with bitter accusations about Aaron stealing his sister. The letter revealed that Brian still viewed Crystal as property to be claimed rather than a person with agency to make her own choices. Aaron shared the letter with Crystal, who laughed at her former brother's delusions. He still doesn't understand that respect is earned, not inherited. The distinction was crucial. Brian had believed that his biological connection to Crystal gave him certain rights and privileges, regardless of how he treated her. Aaron had learned that true family bonds were built through loyalty, sacrifice, and mutual support, qualities that biology couldn't provide. As Aaron reviewed his empire from his office overlooking the city, he reflected on the completeness of his victory. Miranda would spend the next decade in prison, her social standing and financial security permanently destroyed. Seth was dead, his schemes dying with him. Brian was homeless and unemployable, facing a lifetime of consequences for his betrayals. More importantly, Aaron had built something better from the ashes of their destruction. The foundation helped hundreds of families avoid similar exploitation. The medical center treated thousands of patients annually. The business employed hundreds of people and contributed millions to the local economy. Crystal had not only survived her ordeal, but had transformed it into strength that would help other victims for decades to come. Aaron had learned to distinguish between genuine loyalty and convenient opportunism, between character and performance. The final lesson of his experience was the most important. Forgiveness was not weakness, but it required wisdom. Some people deserved second chances, but others had demonstrated fundamental character flaws that made trust impossible. Aaron had forgiven Miranda, Seth, and Brian in the sense that he no longer carried anger about their betrayals. But forgiveness didn't require him to enable further abuse or pretend that their crimes hadn't revealed their true nature. "Do you ever wonder how things might have been different?" Crystal asked during one of their evening conversations. Aaron considered the question carefully. If Miranda had been honest about her feelings, if Seth had been a decent person, If Brian had chosen loyalty over greed, we might still be a family, but we would have been living a lie, and the truth would have emerged eventually. The betrayal had been painful, but ultimately liberating. Aaron no longer had to pretend that people loved him when they merely used him. He no longer had to invest in relationships with people who viewed him as a resource rather than a person. "I'm grateful it happened," Crystal said, surprising Aaron with her words. "Not for the pain, but for the truth. Now I know who really cares about me and who I can trust completely." Aaron smiled at his daughter's wisdom. She had learned at 23 what had taken him 52 years to understand: that authentic relationships were built on truth, not convenience, and that protecting oneself from exploitation was a form of self-respect, not selfishness. As they sat together in comfortable silence, Aaron knew that his campaign of justice had accomplished everything he had hoped. His enemies had been defeated completely, but more importantly, he had discovered who he really was when pushed to his limits. He was not the forgiving fool that Miranda had counted on exploiting. He was not the weak stepfather that Brian had expected to manipulate.